If you can't think for yourselves, think of the guy who was just on the screen here that we were watching. What would be a word that you would think would describe him? Anybody want to volunteer? I can't see hands very well. Yeah. Innovative. I agree. That would be a good word for him. Yeah. Genius. Genius. Yeah, yeah. I think the doctor and Dave, who gave their talks, I'd call them icky smart, but that's just joking. Anybody else? Passionate. Yes. Good. I didn't think I'd get anybody. I want to tell you a story about how I found the word that describes me. I was about 40 years old, and I went to a conference. It was a conference for women. It was led by a woman, and she was a therapist, and so this was kind of a, touchy-feely kind of conference. And at one point during the conference, she looked out at the audience, and she said the same thing that I just said. Think of a word that describes you. And she looked around, and some people were saying nurturer, healer. She looked my way, and I swear to you, without really thinking about it, I said, warrior. And she kind of looked at me and smiled, and I got to know her later as a friend. And she said, no one's ever said that before. So the reason I'm telling you this story about what I feel my mission is in life, or what my calling is in life as a warrior, is because each of you also has a mission on this earth, or a calling. And no matter what your job is, that mission or calling is what is truly fundamental to why you are here on earth. So many of you are high school students, college students. I know right now you're overwhelmed with the issue of, will I go to college? Where will I go to college? Do I really want to go to college? What will my job be? How do I get the experience I need to get a great job? But I'm here to tell you that while a job is important, of course it is, what you do 8 hours a day is important, but it's not what drives your life. Your calling is what drives your life. So let me give you an example. I have a brother-in-law named Marv. Marv knew from the time he was a little boy that he wanted to be a physician, a doctor, medical doctor. So when he was in high school, he knew he had to take certain subjects, biology, obviously, chemistry, whatever. And in college, he knew which colleges were the best ones to get him in the best medical school. He knew what classes he had to take to get into medical school. He then went to medical school, had a wonderful career as a physician. He was an obstetrician, that a word everybody knows, baby doctor. He was an obstetrician for many years, went on to teach at the Duke University Medical School. And his mission, I would say, was healer. Not just physical healer. Marv's mission was to be a physical and a spiritual healer. So for him, it was more about combining those two things. That's what he was about. But lucky, huh? I mean, to know that early on what your mission is, and to be able to plan your whole life around it, and to have a job that fits or melds so well into what your mission is. Because I'm here to tell you that most of us who are in high school don't have a clue what we want to do with our lives. I certainly didn't. So, let me give you another example. When I was about 12 or 13 years old, going to school, I was struggling. And of course, every 12 and 13-year-old struggles in school at that time. And I would go to school and I felt insecure, ugly, shy. But there was a man who worked at the school. He was a janitor. Do you know that word, janitor? The person who goes and cleans the school? His name was Henry, at least that's what he let us call him. I think his real name was Mr. Vanden Bosch. But every time we'd go into school, Mr. Vanden Bosch would stop working if he saw one of us or a group of us, and he would give us a smile. And sometimes if there was time, Mr. Vanden Bosch would also tell us a dumb joke, and we'd groan, you know, like kids do over dumb jokes that adults tell. But you know, I don't think that Henry ever planned to be a janitor. I don't think when he was in high school he planned to be a middle school janitor. I think that that's what happened in his life, given whatever circumstances he came across. But Henry had a mission. He had a calling in his life. His calling was encourager. He encouraged every child that came to school that day. And some 40 years later, of all the teachers and adults that I came into contact with during my schooling, Henry stands out as one that I remember with the most affection. And it was just a smile. But that was his calling. And it had nothing to do with his job. Let me give you one more example. Do we all know who Steve Jobs is? Have you read the biography? Has anyone read the biography, the Isaacson biography of Steve Jobs? Because you'll know the answer to this question if you have. What do you think Steve Jobs' word would be? What was Steve Jobs' mission? What was his calling? Anyone want to venture a guess? No? Not computers. Steve Jobs' calling was to create things of beautiful design. It wasn't about the computer thing. That was his partner. His job could have been and was a great many things during his lifetime, but his mission or his calling was to create beauty. He would argue with people who wanted to change the design of the Apple computer and all the products that came after, who said, no, we're out of money, we're not going to spend any more money or time doing this or that. He said, no, the design is wrong. It has to be this or that. He was passionate about creating things of beauty. Again, he was one of the lucky ones. I think he fell into work that combined his passion and his calling along with his job. What I'm trying to get across to the younger people that are here today is that if you can figure out now what your calling is, and that's hard. I know it's hard for me. It took years of therapy for me to figure out what my calling was. But if you can figure it out now, it will help you with every decision that you make in your life. And you're making so many important decisions right now. I know your life right now feels overwhelming. I remember being that age. If you can decide or even get just a slight handle on what you're passionate about, what your calling is, it will help you make so many of the decisions that you're making right now. Where does your calling come from? Your calling emanates from your most deep and spiritual and emotional being. So that's why it's such hard work. And that's why sometimes people get it at a young age. Some people don't ever get it. So you figure out your calling by figuring out what it is that drives you emotionally and spiritually. For me, a big part of that is my Christian faith. It impacts every decision I make because it's a part of the deepest part of who I am. But it's also part of who I am to be a warrior. I'm passionate about representing people who cannot represent themselves, those who are the most vulnerable in this world. The emotions that drive your mission, then, do they have to be positive or can they be negative? When I was young, I grew up in a somewhat dysfunctional family. And that's not a joke, because the joke in our family is there are no functional families. So I grew up in a somewhat dysfunctional family. I grew up with a dad who had an alcohol problem. He also had 5 kids, and it was a little overwhelming for him. So, you know, he wasn't able to spend as much time with each of us as I'm sure he would have liked. But as I grew into my teenage years, the emotion I felt strongest was anger. I was angry at him, and I was angry at the rest of the world for not helping me figure out why he was the way he was. Negative emotions are exhausting. Do you know that? They're exhausting. But I held on to that anger. I was passionate about it. So anger made me choose which college to go to. Anger made me pick which law school to go to. Anger made me pick litigation as the field I would go into, because, gosh, you can get rid of a lot of anger when you're a litigation attorney. But I also became a public defender. And part of being a public defender, do you know, again, I hope I'm not using terminology you don't know. Public defender is an attorney who's paid to represent poor people, indigent people. They're paid by the government to do that. So the first 5 years I practiced law, I was a public defender. And I worked intimately every day with people who were the poorest of the poor, who were abused and neglected, children taken out of their homes who were abused and neglected, women who'd been abused, men and women who had committed crimes out of desperation usually, into drugs, into alcohol, people that were, you know, the dregs, and people that were completely vulnerable. Because not only had they lived a very difficult life, but now they're probably going to go to prison, because most of them were guilty after all. After 5 years of doing that, I figured out that the anger I had was all about me. And I decided I had to change that anger, because, as I said, it was exhausting. That anger changed to compassion, and that became the emotion that drove me. And that leads me to my final point for you. If the emotions that drive your passion, and therefore drive your calling in life, are always negative, if they are always turned inward and about you, you will never be happy. You will never feel fulfilled. Your passion for your mission or your calling has at some point to go outside of yourself. It has to be about giving to someone else or something else. When it was all about anger, for me, it was about me. When I changed it to compassion, I became happier. I became emotionally healthier, and I had a purpose in life. It didn't change my word. It didn't change the word that described me. In all those situations, I was still a warrior. I was somebody who, for whatever reason, had the personality and the ability to stand up and speak for those people who could not speak for themselves. And that's a powerful mission. It was a calling that I became very proud of, and I'm very proud of it today. There's a quote from a woman, Brene Brown. Maybe you have heard of her. She did a TED Talk some years ago that she thought might get 100 hits. It's now up to 6 million hits. You should listen to it. It's her TED Talk in Houston, Texas. One of the things that she talked about was vulnerability. She's a social scientist. She said, and I quote, "The most accurate measure of courage is vulnerability." The most accurate measurement of courage is vulnerability. For you to understand what your calling is in life, you do need to make yourself very vulnerable. You need to dig deep and be honest with yourself. For some people, this comes early. For some, it comes only when they're hitting the bottom. Do you know that American expression? When they hit bottom, when there's nothing left to live for, they finally are so vulnerable that they can say, okay, it's either I kill myself or I figured out what it is that I'm here on this earth for. I've seen that happen. But with some people, it never happens. With my father, he was 70 years old before he finally figured it out. For some people, they never figure it out, and I think never figuring it out means never really feeling fulfilled in life. I'd like to close with one example. And again, this one inspires me. It made a huge impression on me because I am a Christian. I read a biography recently about a German named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Has anybody heard of him? This is a Swiss crowd. German crowd. Dietrich Bonhoeffer lived during World War II. He was a German, and he was in his late 20s and early 30s during World War II. Bonhoeffer trained as a minister in the Christian church. I think it was the Lutheran church, I'm not sure. He was very bright, very articulate, very good writer, a leader. He was a teacher, a scholar, and already in his late 20s, he was looked upon by other ministers as kind of a pastor's pastor. I mean, his gifts were recognized at a very young age, the late 20s, as being special. He happened to be in the United States studying, doing graduate work during the outbreak of World War II, and he was told by all of his friends, don't go back to Germany. He decided voluntarily to go back in any case. So his job prior to the war was teacher and pastor to other pastors. His mission was, in my opinion, leadership, and also leading and teaching by word and example. During the war, Bonhoeffer's job changed. Because he was German and because he was somewhat the head of the church there, he was allowed to go in and out of Germany very freely, to Switzerland, to England, to other countries, and to meet with other people in those countries. Bonhoeffer became a double agent. He started working for the Allied forces as a spy, and he passed information about what was happening in Germany to people in Switzerland and England, probably not France, but not only was he endangering his life by doing this, but he also, very close to the end of the war, joined a group of people who had made an attempt on Adolf Hitler's life. It was a failed attempt, but it was an attempt, and so Bonhoeffer became an assassin. So, double agent, assassin, teacher, pastor's pastor, those jobs changed pretty dramatically. But his mission and his calling didn't change at all. He remained a leader of pastors, leader of people, a writer. He was, of course, put in prison after the assassination attempt, and he wrote from prison, and he continued to lead by example and by word from prison. So he was inspiring to me in terms of this talk. He was killed literally days before the end of the war. So, I guess to reiterate my point, our circumstances may change, our emotions may change, our jobs may change, but our calling really doesn't change. And my hope is that for you, you find that calling as soon as possible. So has your word changed? The word you thought of at the beginning? Think about it. Thank you.